The 1980s was truly a decade to remember. The 80s made huge technological advances that paved the way for decades in the future. The 80s is arguably one of the most influential pop cultures in any American decade. Movies, music, and TV of the 80s is still very relevant in today's day and age, and the references in today's pop culture aren't going anywhere. The 80s is a very important time in American history, and it shouldn't and won't be forgotten anytime soon.
The differences between the Western world and basically the communist society. So there was a lot of talk about the Cold War, even though we were at the tail end of the Cold War, and that included the things that we saw in even pop culture that indicated the differences between the U.S. and Russia, such as in movies and in books. And also, eventually, the fall of the Berlin Wall in the late 80s. Traces its roots back to the 1980s. Probably the most important was the personal computer. So in the early 1980s, IBM and Apple were racing to really mass produce the personal computer. IBM probably, in a sense, won because they made more computers that were more accessible to more people. But the technology that was made by Apple at the time, especially the graphical user interface aspect of the Apple II or the Mac, the Apple II at the time, or the Mac II, was one of the most significant technological advances probably of the entire century. And today's technology is really based on a lot of the same concepts that came out of the Apple II.
Okay. Do you want to play rough? Okay. Uno. Say hello to my little friend.
What were some of the biggest films in the 1980s?
Well, you had the Star Wars series, which technically Star Wars 1 was in the 70s, but Empire Strikes Back was 1980 or 81, and Return of the Jedi was 1983 or 84. So those were definitely among the biggest. But you also had other important movies like The Extraterrestrial, E.T., the original Indiana Jones, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, also Indiana Jones. The following two films were good and both made in the 80s. But you had a whole series of movies that were really good and all dealt with the Vietnam War. So this was, 7 to 10 years after some of the major events from the Vietnam War. You started seeing films like, even 15 years after the war, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Born on the 4th of July, The Thin Red Line, Jacob's Ladder, which may have been 1989 or 1990. But you had a whole series of films, Good Morning Vietnam, that were really, really good movies and that really described the Vietnam era, the Vietnam War era, 10 or 15 years after the war itself. And all of those were very good films. On top of those, you had major blockbusters like Back to the Future, you had Ghostbusters, and you had films like Die Hard, Crocodile Dundee. Some of those were more pop culture oriented, but they were probably all blockbuster films. For starters, at the beginning of the 1980s, you had a whole number of bands that weren't necessarily American, but they became part of the American mainstream musical scene. So that includes bands like Duran Duran. It includes bands like Men at Work from Australia. It includes a lot of female bands from that time, like Belinda Carlisle and the Go-Go's and a number of other bands. Many of them came from the UK. Others came from Australia or New Zealand. Aha was another band. There was a whole bunch of bands that were just from outside of the US. And for the first time since probably the 1950s and early 60s, in a significant way, apart from say the late 60s. A lot of people began listening to a lot of these bands from outside of the U.S. But apart from that, you had big albums and big hits coming from music by Michael Jackson, by Madonna, by Prince, by other American bands like Cheap Trick, REO Speedwagon, Styx, Chicago, and many others.
In conclusion, the 1980s marked one of the greatest American decades of all time. The 80s still lives on with us today through the historical events, technology, movies, and music.